Hey everyone, welcome back to The Tent, your place for politics, policy, and progress. I'm Daniella Gibbs-Leger.
And I'm Erin Phillips, filling in for Colin Seeberger. Daniella, are you preparing for the eclipse next week?
If you mean, do I have eclipse sunglasses? Yes.
Whoa.
Yeah, I know. I feel like
fancy gear.
I am way ahead of the game here. I got some for my kid.
Okay.
His school, like they're going to go out on their field and see it. And it looks like if the clouds clear, like we make it like a pretty cool, 80% eclipse thing happening.
Okay, I have to run out and get my sunglasses. I don't know what I've been doing, but I apparently have not been preparing appropriately.
Obviously not.
Well, I'm very excited to hopefully catch a bit of it, but I'm also excited to catch the great interview you had this week.
Yeah, I spoke with filmmaker Leo Chiang about his Oscar-nominated documentary, Island in Between, about the state of relations between Taiwan, China, and the U.S. Just a note for our listeners that this was recorded before Wednesday's earthquake, so you won't hear it mentioned in this interview, but our hearts go out to everyone impacted.
Yeah, sending a lot of support to those recovering from the earthquake, but I can't wait to hear from Leo. I was a big fan of his documentary, so very excited. But first, of course, we have to get to some news.
You know we do. And following President Biden's speech at the White House this week on lowering healthcare costs, I wanted to talk a bit about some of the progress that's been made on that front in the last few years. Policies like the Inflation Reduction Act have helped provide much needed relief for Americans by doing things like capping insulin costs at $35 a month for seniors on Medicare, capping annual out-of-pocket costs for folks on Medicare Part D at $2,000, and cutting healthcare premiums by an average of $800 a year for healthcare marketplace shoppers. The Inflation Reduction Act also empowered the administration to negotiate with Big Pharma to lower the cost of certain prescription drugs for people on Medicare. The first 10 drugs selected for negotiations, which began earlier this year, are used by over 9 million Medicare Part D beneficiaries. President Biden just announced that they've submitted counteroffers to those drug companies for the price they'd like the drugs to be listed at for those Medicare beneficiaries. All of this is expected to lead to real cost savings for consumers. Case in point, a new analysis from the Center for American Progress this week estimates that price negotiations will cut the cost of most of these drugs roughly in half.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a lot. Which means, just to give you some examples, the 3.5 million Medicare beneficiaries who use the blood thinner Eliquis will save about $123 a month. That's a lot of money. The biggest total savings would be for cancer patients on Medicare who rely on the drug Imbruvica. They could save over $6,500 on a 30-day supply.
I don't even know what I'd do with $6,500. And they're just getting that money back. That's money that they would normally have to spend.
Exactly. And listen, whether it's $123 or $6,500, every little bit counts for people who rely on these medications in their daily lives. You may remember last year we talked with Robin Craycroft, a woman from Arizona whose insulin savings allowed her to take her first vacation in years, as well as a trip to see her grandchildren.
How could I forget? Robin's story was so heartwarming, and we can just imagine that the savings from these drug price negotiations will lead to similar outcomes for many more Americans like her. And that's why the White House has called to expand Medicare drug price negotiations and broaden some of those cost-saving measures you talked about in the Inflation Reduction Act, like the out-of-pocket maximum and the monthly insulin caps, to apply to all Americans, not just those on Medicare. And this week, as President Biden addressed in his remarks on Wednesday, the administration's efforts also led to a capping of costs on inhalers. That means most patients will pay just $35 for them, compared to prices as high as $645 previously. Again, a lot of money.
Yes.
The administration also newly announced a program that would urge hospitals to pay more for drugs to stop shortages. This is all super welcome news. And at the same time as healthcare costs are going down, it's worth noting that coverage is also going up. We talked a little bit about the 14th anniversary of the Affordable Care Act. Enrollment in the ACA has grown by 9 million over the past 3 years, with a record 45 million Americans receiving coverage that stems from the ACA. And despite surviving, 70 repeal attempts.
70?
70 repeal attempts since it was passed in 2010, the ACA is favored by a majority of Americans, which is why it's shocking that extreme lawmakers continue their assault on the ACA and other programs. We talked last week about the House Republican Study Committee's proposed budget, which suggested, among other things, stripping away $4.5 trillion in funding from the ACA, Medicaid, and the Children's Health Insurance Program. In a moment when more Americans than ever before are getting the health care they need at a price they can actually manage, we can't afford to turn back the clock on real progress.
No, we can't. And speaking of real progress, I want to turn to a topic from over the weekend. March 31st was Transgender Day of Visibility. Here with us to explain the importance of this day and the continued fight for trans rights is Cait Smith, Director of LGBTQI Policy at CAP Action. Cait, thanks for joining us on the tent.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, we saw a lot of absolutely wild misinformation over the weekend about the intersection of Trans Day of Visibility and Easter, with far right conspiracy theorists claiming it was some quote unquote woke plot. But Trans Day of Visibility is recognized every year on March 31st. So, can you cut through the noise and explain for our listeners the origins and significance of this day?
Yeah, absolutely. And you are totally right. Transgender Day of Visibility is celebrated every year on March 31st and has been since it was created in 2010. This is a really important day for transgender and non-binary folks. It was created really because transgender folks, our community, were so used to seeing headline after headline about attacks on our community, about violence towards our community. And Transgender Day of Visibility is a day to celebrate joy, to celebrate the contributions and voices of transgender and non-binary people. And so it's a really, really important celebration and honoring of the community that, yes, happens every year on March 31st.
Yeah, well, we know transphobia is longstanding. In recent years, it just feels like we've seen an uptick of extreme politicians around the country scapegoating the trans community for political gain. In light of these attacks, how do you feel the trans community is doing collectively, and what can policymakers be doing to better protect and support folks?
Yeah, and it absolutely has been a rise in attacks. In 2017, we saw about 100 bills considered across the country that were anti-LGBT bills. In 2023, that number was north of 650 anti-LGBT
Wow.
bills. So we are absolutely experiencing a really massive uptick in attacks and debates on transgender rights and non-binary people's rights. It's so important for legislators to share solidarity with the community, and I think that's one really easy way for folks to feel seen. There's also really important policies that are helpful for the community, like non-discrimination protections, protections on access to best practice medical care, and policies that help trans and non-binary students feel safe and affirmed at schools.
So, we're heading into an election year where we're likely to see radical candidates politicizing trans existence as a manufactured campaign issue. How concerned are you about the continued impacts like these kinds of attacks could have? And what can we do to fight misinformation about the trans community this year?
I'm very concerned. One statistic that I think is really important here is according to a recent survey by the Trevor Project of thousands of young LGBTQ people, 85% of them said that they're watching the news and media reports about LGBT rights. Young people are watching, and young people are scared. The LGBT community, and particularly trans and non-binary folks, are scared right now. And it's really, really important that we are proactively pushing the correct information that, transgender folks are just as deserving as everybody else of safety, of equality and dignity. And important to really speak, I think, particularly to young people to show them that they're loved, that they're cared for. And again, circling back to Transgender Day of Visibility, a really, really big pro for that day is being able to show up for young people too.
Yeah, so I think that was like a little bit of optimism, but to really close on a positive note, the Biden administration is currently considering updates to the 1557 rule of the Affordable Care Act, which, if finalized, would help protect against LGBTQI plus discrimination in healthcare. Can you talk about what these updates would do and why they're needed?
These updates are super exciting. Essentially, what they would do is ensure that federally funded healthcare programs, services, health insurance, including Medicare and Medicaid, would equitably cover LGBTQ folks and make sure that discrimination against sexual orientation or gender identity is prohibited. This is really far-reaching and really allows LGBT folks to access healthcare that they need, insurance that they need, without that fear of discrimination. One reason this is really important is that we know, according to a recent survey completed by CAP, is that about 50% of transgender and non-binary people are reporting that they're afraid to share with their doctors their gender identity. Super huge number because they're afraid of discrimination. They're afraid of being denied access to medical care. So even that fear, right, is such a huge impact on folks avoiding medical care, avoiding having a good relationship with their providers. So this is a really, really wide-reaching rule, and we're really hopeful and excited for it to hopefully be finalized.
Well, Cait, I want to thank you for all the work that you do at Cap Action, and I want to thank you for joining us on The Tent today.
Yeah, thank you so much.
That's all the time we have for today. If there's anything else you'd like us to cover on the pod, hit us up on Twitter at The Tent Pod. That's at The Tent Pod. And stick around for my interview with Leo Chiang in just the beat. Leo Chiang is a filmmaker based in San Francisco and Taipei. His 2023 New York Times opinion documentary, Island in Between, was nominated for this year's Oscars. He's directed a number of other critically acclaimed films, including Our Time Machine and A Village Called Versailles, which were both nominated for Emmys. Leo is a co-founder of the Asian American Documentary Network and has taught documentary production at schools including UC Berkeley and Northwestern. Leo Chiang, thank you so much for joining us on The Tent.
Thank you for having me, Daniella. And I like that bio. Maybe I'll borrow it from you. I've now revised this latest little blurb bit about the Academy Awards. So that's on my list to do.
I like how you call it a little blurb. This is a big deal. And we at The Tent here, we are big fans of your most recent film, Island in Between, which was nominated for an Oscar this year. So tell us about the documentary. What inspired you to blend your personal story with the broader topic of Taiwan's complex relationship with China and the U.S.?
Well, I think, having been born in Taiwan and grew up in the U.S., all my life I've had to explain Taiwan to people, not the least of which is to kind of get people straightened out between Taiwan and Thailand. People constantly still confused till this day. So when I had a chance to tell a Taiwanese story, I wanted to make it as resonant and accessible to an international audience as possible. And I feel like because of my, fairly unique background, being a transnational person, having lived a long time in the U.S., having also spent time in China for work, that if I can place my story in the film, maybe it will be easier for the international audience to relate. So that's what we ultimately decided to do. That certainly was not how we planned it at the beginning, but I think we made the right choice.
So you start the film with scenes from an island of Taiwan called Kinmen, which is physically very close to China. I had no idea it was that close. So tell our listeners, what's the significance of this particular island and what has its proximity to China revealed about the relationship between China and Taiwan historically and today?
So the Kinmen Islands, which is a small archipelago, very, very close to the Chinese mainland, it's literally hugged by the bay that the Chinese city Xiamen is situated. And that was literally the last battle line of the Chinese Civil War that ended in 1949. Ending is maybe not an accurate portrayal because they continue to be bombing on both sides, but that was where they decided to draw the line. Fast forward to 50 years later in 2000, when the relationship has gotten much better between Taiwan and China, that was also the first place where the two sides decided to actually run a ferry. So the Taiwanese and the Chinese people can actually travel across to visit each other, to see the sites that their parents have never had the chance to, because of total shutdown in communication between 1950 and in the late 1990s, I believe. So this place is historically very, very significant, and like all borders, between two sides that are maybe perceived as in conflict, it's full of really, really interesting stories and really fascinating points of views in terms of the way that they view the conflict across the Taiwan Strait, the way that they view the relationship of both Taiwan and China with U.S. So it's just really rich, a great place to kind of mine interesting interactions and conversations.
So, as someone who travels frequently between the US, China, and Taiwan, what changes have you witnessed over the last 5 years? Now, you mentioned in the documentary that you no longer travel to China and that you aren't sure when you'll be able to return. Why is that?
Well, I started traveling to China in the around like 2005. And that was a very exciting time in China. I think it's not just the Taiwanese people, but folks from all over the world was seeing, China, the Chinese society opening up more and engaging more with the international community, if you will. And exciting things was happening. I mean, obviously, there's this sort of incredible economic boom that's been well documented, but also, interesting art was coming out, interesting writing, just feels like it's just such a exciting new place. And having studied China, having grew up in Taiwan during the martial law time, really we learned Chinese history more than Taiwanese history. So having studied China and being ethnically Chinese, I saw it as an opportunity to go to a place that would be just absolutely fascinating to find stories. As documentarians, that's what we live for, right? We want to go to interesting places and meet interesting people, find interesting stories. So I started to go there both for work, to make films, to do work, but I also taught there actually. For one semester, I actually brought a group of American students from University of Southern California, which is my alma mater, to the Beijing, the Chinese Communications University, and did kind of an exchange. So a lot of really exciting things was happening, and my last independent feature length documentary called Our Time Machine was shot in Shanghai. But in the mid 2010s, things felt like it was turning. Start to hear stories from colleagues and friends in China that the freedom to kind of discuss or to make films about subject matters that they wanted was kind of getting not as free as it was before. The censorship was was definitely kind of coming back up. It so happens to overlap with the Xi Jinping administration, right? So it's happened really, really quickly, and I think that maybe COVID also exacerbated it. Certainly, and I mentioned this in the film. Certainly, the relationship between China and Hong Kong, the Chinese government and Hong Kong, and what happened with the umbrella movement and the clampdown, the new restrictive laws in the last few years have just really kind of turned things backwards, if you will. At least from my point of view, right? Maybe they don't see it that way, but I think me and a lot of other folks who might be watching China would consider this as sort of a more back to a more restrictive time. So I've not been back to China since 2019, I believe, or 2018. I can't really even remember. It's not because I'm not allowed to. As a Taiwanese citizen, China considers me also a Chinese citizen, right? Even though I don't necessarily see myself that way. So there should be no problem for me to go there. I don't know what will happen when I go there, because obviously with this film and the notice that it's been getting, I'm sure I'm on their radar somehow. I think the film is pretty nuanced, right? It doesn't necessarily demonize a certain side, but I don't know, right? Like I think that's always been the issue. The tricky part about this Chinese administration is no one knows what it wants to do or what it will do. Whether it be sort of individual, people who are expressing their opinions that the government does not agree with, or with Taiwan, nobody knows what the government is going to do. So it's almost like in some ways it's almost like a mourning more than anything else of me not wanting to go back, because I feel like I might feel sad to see things kind of going back to the, the more restrictive times. So.
Yeah, I want to talk about Taiwan and the elections that were held earlier this year. We saw China try all types of tactics to influence the outcome, from strong political statements, increased militarization, threats of economic punishment, misinformation, and disinformation. And yet, voters turned out en masse and elected the candidate that China actually opposed. So, what does this outcome signal about Taiwan's resiliency? And with the new president's inauguration coming up in May, what could it mean for future China-Taiwan relations?
Well, I mean, obviously the election very much was about the cross-strait relationship, but it's also about more than that, right? Like Taiwanese people, like people anywhere else, is especially young people, right, confronting like the unaffordability of living in a society that's getting more and more expensive. There's economic situations and issues that they're confronted with. So they're also voting, with those other issues in consideration. But it's definitely, Taiwanese folks are I think that it's saying to China, I mean, what the Chinese government did in Hong Kong, all these, threatening measures, it only makes the Taiwanese electorate more wanting to support a government that is going to, advocate for them, right? I don't necessarily think anything's going to be, hugely different, because the new President Lai, the president to be, right, the inauguration is in May, is the current vice president. He's been the current vice president for 8 years, so he's very much of a known quantity. He's practicing the same policy, so he's, at least that's what he's saying, that he will continue the President Tsai's policy. So, I mean, yes, China did do all sort of song and dance, but it has done that every time there was an election in Taiwan. So I mean, and I'm not dismissing it, but it's also not this, this sort of huge threat or the huge sort of game changer that maybe some from the outside think that it might be. I again, nobody knows what's going to happen, but it's not a huge shift in terms of the direction of the Taiwanese government.
Got it. In the film, you showed differing attitudes among Taiwanese people when it comes to U.S. assistance and support for Taiwan. So, what role do you think the U.S. can and should play in the relationship between China and Taiwan? And, why do you think it's so important for our lawmakers to continue providing that support?
I mean, I'm not a geopolitical expert, right? I always say these are my personal opinion. As somebody who is, somewhat educated about these issues, right? As somebody who live it, as somebody who has been following the development, and as somebody who does, who is invested in the American political system, and what has been really great, at least from my point of view, is this continuous visits from various delegations of American lawmakers, bipartisan lawmakers, to come to Taiwan, signaling that at least at this point, the U.S. government is supportive of Taiwan. I'm saying at this point is because I'm looking at what's happening in Ukraine. And it worries me, because I think 2 years ago, Ukraine was also a bipartisan, and also had bipartisan support in the U.S. Congress. And now it doesn't, So maybe that's me being a worrywart, being paranoid about, something that maybe I shouldn't be so worried about. But that would be my primary concern, is that, yes, I feel like it's really great that there's this constant show of support, but I don't think me nor a lot of Taiwanese people are counting on the American support. It just, I don't know. I mean, I feel like sometimes I being the jaded American, not sort of taking off my Taiwanese hat and putting on my American hat on. Being the jaded American that I am, I feel like when it's all said and done, U.S. gonna look after its own interests first, and especially with the whole America First policy. So I don't know. It's another source of concern. And if you read up on some of the latest polls about Taiwanese opinion towards the U.S., there is much more skepticism than there's ever been. I mean, I grew up in a society where U.S. is kind of like the promised land. The Taiwanese people really did look to the U.S. as our protector. Maybe foolishly, maybe that's kind of what happens. When the U.S. has been kind of a constant presence in our lives. But I feel like that's shifting. I don't know if people are so find the U.S. support to be so reliable anymore.
Well, that could definitely be the topic of another documentary about U.S., how the U.S. is viewed across the globe. So before we go, we have to talk about the Oscars. As we mentioned, your film was nominated for one, and you got to attend your first Oscar ceremony. So I need the details. What celebrities did you meet? What interesting thing did you see maybe off camera that we wouldn't know about? Spill it.
Well, so besides the ceremony itself, there were all these events leading up to it, and it was just kind of like one celebrity after another. And when it's all said and done, I am just a total cinephile. Both celebrity, to me, are both the actors, but also these like incredible filmmakers that I've worshipped, all my life and all my career. To be able to see like Scorsese standing right there next to Spielberg, next to somebody like Alexander Payne. I took pictures with Jodie Foster,
Ooh.
with, and Emma Stone. It's kind of like a little boy in a candy store. One thing, though, that I wasn't expecting, and I think it ended up to be kind of a fun thing was, everybody's talking about that Ryan Gosling performance, right?
Yes.
The I'm Just Ken performance. So when the backup dancers went onto the stage, it actually kind of ran right by us, because all the nominees are sitting in the aisle. And so they ran right by us. And at the end, they actually came right back and all of us sort of stuck our hand out. So they kind of high-fived everybody on the way out. It was sort of electrifying. It's actually one of the better shows. Oscar, ceremonies in recent years, I think. So it was really thrilling to be able to be there and to hopefully look sharp and in our fancy clothes and being a nominee. All of it, I love. It's been really incredible.
That's so awesome. And yes, I think the I'm Just Ken performance was amazing. And I agree with you. I thought it was one of the best Oscar telecasts that I've seen, like maybe ever. It was fantastic. Well, I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us, and congratulations again on your nomination. And thank you so much for joining us on the tent.
Thank you so much, Daniella. This has been very fun.
As always, thanks for listening. Be sure to go back and check out previous episodes. All right, Erin, got to talk about it before we go. March Madness.
I don't want to talk about it.
Now, why don't you want to talk about
Because
it?
last year, as you know, I won my first ever March Madness bracket, and I'm not doing so great this year.
Where are you right now in the standings?
23rd out of like 30.
All right.
Talk about it. I had some faith in Houston. I wanted to mix it up. I didn't want to like go with the Huskies again.
That's fair. Sometimes when you mix it up, that's what happens.
Yeah.
You mix yourself right out of contention. I'm in ninth place, so I'm obviously not winning either.
Top 10 though.
Top 10.
third.
Yeah, for now.
Happy for you.
Thank you.
Who do you have winning?
I had Tennessee winning, so womp womp.
Womp womp.
I'm not going to win. That's okay. Although in another bracket, I have Purdue, so I still have a chance.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe next year I just need to do 2 brackets. Maybe I need to really get serious.
You probably do. I honestly have 5 brackets going.
Wow.
Yeah, one of them is a
Not
fundraiser
all.
for a friend. No, I have one for CAP, one for a group of friends, and then there's a old Obama staff bracket that Obama participates in. There's like 500 people.
Are there any famous people in that bracket?
Besides the president?
Is he in the
Yeah,
bracket?
he's in the bracket.
Wow.
Aside from him, no, I don't
What
think
do
so.
you do if you beat President Obama?
He
in March
hasn't.
Madness?
He hasn't won, so.
Okay, well.
no shade, but he hasn't.
His attentions are focused elsewhere.
This is true.
I should have done a women's bracket. I think I also might want to do a women's bracket next year. I'm really invested in the Iowa saga.
Let me tell you, I've been following women's basketball, not as much as men's, admittedly, but towards the end, their play has been off the charts. They're so good, and I don't want to say they're better than the men, but I like their style of play better because it's all fundamentals, right? It's like
Yeah.
if you're there, like you can hoop. Like there's no show. Well, there is showmanship, but it's just such talent, and I love to see it. I love to see these like really strong, assertive, like women with points of view and personalities, just like dueling it out on a court. So it's been great television watching.
Yeah, I think I need to tune into the next game.
Yes.
But if I can't win the bracket, I am rooting for our lead producer Kelly McCoy.
That's
who
right.
is currently in second on the women's bracket.
Come on, Kelly.
So we're rooting for you, Kelly. You have to carry on the tent legacy, the tent name. But speaking of my faith in Houston,
Nice transition there.
happy Cowboy Carter Week.
Woo! Let me tell you something. Oh, this album is everything.
It's so good.
It's so great, and just the harmonies and the music and like the little details that like me as a music nerd like just pick up on listening. Like I'm like, oh my gosh, do you hear that little like guitar back there and this and that? It's hard to pick a favorite song. Right now, I'm into my Yaya, period.
Yaya is definitely up there for me.
Mhm.
I personally I don't know if I've really thought about what my favorite song is, but I've seen so many people talk about their favorite song, and I feel like there's some 16 Carriages erasure going on.
Yeah.
Like, that song is beautiful. It really
is.
just struck me from the get-go. So maybe that's my favorite right now.
Yeah, no, it is beautiful. And I will say that the first time I heard Two Most Wanted, I cried. When I listen to really good music sometimes, like it's not even the words, it's like the melodies that just like move me. And that did it for me. Their voices are like, so wonderful.
She really takes you from one thing to another, and you somehow don't get whiplash because it's all just pulled together so
Yeah.
nicely.
It works.
It's so many different ideas going on, but it's not jarring at all.
No,
it's incredible.
And you can tell like she really worked on this for years. Like it's phenomenal.
Yeah. Well, as our lead producer Kelly said, if she doesn't win the Grammy, maybe we have to go and peacefully protest outside the Grammys.
Exactly.
As a team.
Perhaps, some live broadcasting for the Grammys. We'll work that into the budget. All right, well, that's going to do it for us this week. Take care of yourselves. It's allergy season. I say that every week, but it's true and it's so bad. So get yourself medicated if you need to, and we will talk to you next week. The Tent is a podcast from the Center for American Progress Action Fund. It's hosted by me, Daniella Gibbs-Leger, and co-hosted by Colin Seeberger. Erin Phillips is our lead producer and guest host for this episode. Kelly McCoy is our supervising producer. Kai Fan, Matthew Gossage, Tony Pandolfo, and Olivia Mowry are our video producers. Mishka Espy is our booking producer, and Muggs Leone is our digital producer. You can find us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts.